Perhaps we can take a moment to do welcomes, updates, and so forth. So, Hanieh?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
No, so we're very excited to announce that, well, Marcy and I made contacts with Representative of Illinois, Chuy Garcia's office today on his recent bill, 986, if I am not mistaken, which is pretty much urging the Biden administration to release the funds to countries that have been sanctioned for vaccines and for medical supplies. We made contacts with them, and we would like to introduce that bill to the legislative committee of the CDP in April. So we're working with that team to ensure that the bill gets sponsors and supporters, and it is the HR 986. I'll share it with you momentarily. We're very happy about that. We just submitted our 2 resolutions that was overwhelmingly supported by 10 different regions and the Central Committee. Dr. Bill played a huge part in making sure that the resolutions passed and were endorsed. So we're very, very happy.
Hanieh is talking about the California Democratic Party, though. We
Yes.
welcome all parties on this call, and we're nonpartisan.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. How about you, Medea?
Well, on the Iran front, the U.S. is supposed to be doing a proposal sometime in the next few days to Iran, but rumor has it that the Iranians have already rejected it because it doesn't, it's not just a straight lifting of the sanctions and getting back into the deal. So we're concerned that there's still no, we'll see what the proposal is like. So be on the lookout. Yemen, there's a little bit of opening in the Saudi blockade of Yemen with one of the fuel ships getting through. But we still are having our demands that the US government should force the Saudis to lift the blockade. And of course, what we want is to end the war. There's a group of young Yemeni Americans who've started a hunger strike, and they're camping out in Washington, D.C., and we all want to support them. And on the budget, I'll leave it to Rob, maybe you could just confirm or deny that that Biden is supposed to be coming out with his budget like any day, like Thursday or Friday. And we think in terms of the Pentagon part, it's going to be pretty much the same as it was last year. So gearing up to push for a reduction. Is that the case?
Confirmed.
What'd you say?
Confirmed.
Confirmed. Okay.
It's a little hard to hear you, Robert. I'm not sure if there's an echo or something.
Yeah.
I'll project, don't worry.
Here we go.
Okay. So that's just one of the many campaigns that Rob is involved with. He's stepped up with Public Citizen to really put some fire under the push to cut the Pentagon budget. And we are very grateful for that.
Yes, thank you. We have with us Alan Minsky, I believe, of the Progressive Democrats of America, and he has an update on a very important letter that will be part of our action alert. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to slot myself in after Rob, actually, because Rob may not know this, but PDA has been part of the team that has been reaching out to try to get congressional offices to sign onto a letter that's been led by Jan Schakowsky's office to get the Biden administration to waive for the TRIPS waiver agreement. And Rob will explain that in detail, and then I'll just jump in with a great way that people on the call can participate in this and help out. This is super important humanitarian work, and this is humanitarian work that extends to all of humanity, but again, speaks directly to the inequality of vaccine distribution in the world. So thank you to Public Citizen, Global Trade Watch for leading on this. Thank you, CODEPINK, for pulling this together. I am here simply as an organizer, and the expertise is going to come from Rob.
Thank you so much, Alan. And thank you to Progressive Democrats of America for promoting our Zoom and engaging more people in this conversation about demilitarization and progressive foreign policy. Right now, Mary, if you can, please post in the chat the link to sign up to be a congressional district liaison. We're going to be partnering, so we're nonpartisan, well, we are, but we're also going to be partnering with PDA, Progressive Democrats of America. You just heard from Alan, the executive director, on developing congressional district liaisons who can deliver our message district by district and work with others in the district who are focused on foreign policy. It's super important. So please, if you're interested, fill out the form in the chat. We would love to have you involved. Also, at this point, I would love to share with you our website, our web portal. Mary, if you're able to bring that up, CODEPINK Congress, it's at codepink.org/CODEPINK Congress. There we go. And you can easily Google it, it comes right up. As you'll see, we have, here's the front page. Let's demand greater accountability from Congress. Join us in mobilizing co-sponsors and votes for peace legislation. If you scroll down, you will see where you can tell your friends to sign up. And also our various action alerts from past shows. So let's take a look at what we're looking at today is we're going to ask all of you to please stay on to the end of the show, or to, excuse me, to when our speaker in the Q&A is done. Then we are going to call Congress, and Hanieh is going to lead us through that, to urge specific action around vaccine equity. So Mary, is there a way that you can scroll back up to the various shows that we've had? There we go. So last week it was Haiti, and then we heard from workers in Venezuela. And if you go to this site, you'll see all the different shows. Here are the archived meetings as well. People also ask me, where can we see this? We also have a YouTube link, which we can post in the chat, and all the shows are posted there too. If we can just go back for a minute to the toolkit, I would like to single out the legislation that we will be talking about in the action portion of this show. So, okay, if we go down to track legislation, there we go. And can you go down a little bit? There we go. HR 986, Robust International Response to Pandemic Act. So that's the Chuy Garcia bill. And if you can click on the HR 986, we can show how we link directly to the text of the legislation. You can see 16 co-sponsors now. You can click on the text and you can see who the co-sponsors are. You can read the entire bill and share it with your congressperson. And that's that. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to urge people to join our Google group. We have about 800 people in the Google group, often getting emails from people right before the Zoom. How do I get the link? Where is the link? So in the Google group, I'm trying to send that link out right before the show and early in the morning, so you'll get it numerous times. Oftentimes our blasts get buried in promotions, which is really spam, and they can be difficult to find. But the Google group, it makes it very easy. All right, I think that's good.
One other thing I forgot to mention, if anybody is in the New Jersey or around New York City, we're going to be doing a rally outside Senator Bob Menendez's house. He lives in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, and it's going to be about Iran, because he is the one that really is putting a monkey wrench into the whole deal. So it's important that he hear from us, and we would love to see any of you there. And I'll put my email in the chat if you want to get in touch with me to get more information. I'll also put the link to the event there. Thanks.
Thank you for organizing that, Medea and CODEPINK, New Jersey.
And I'm going to be driving over 8 hours to go there. So if you were anywhere less than that, you should join me.
That's right. Senator Bob Menendez is chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So, and the ranking member is Marco Rubio. So they're quite a team, you know, in terms of their hawkishness, trying to crush the Iran deal, pushing for a forever blockade of Cuba and coups in Venezuela. I mean, the war, it's bad. So we need all the pressure we can exert on Menendez to back off because he seems to have some undue influence on President Biden. Okay, so tonight, I believe the agenda is in the chat. We are focusing on the campaign for people's vaccine equity, not medical apartheid. And we're very pleased to have Robert Weissman of Public Citizen with us. We had also invited a professor, Rath Satyajit from India. I'm not sure if are you on the call? It's very early in the morning in India. Hopefully he'll join us. If not, we're ready to go with Robert Weissman. I'm going to introduce you, Robert. Robert Weissman is the president of Public Citizen, a staunch public interest advocate and activist, as well as an expert on corporate and government accountability. From 1989 to 2009, Robert was editor of the Multinational Monitor, a magazine that tracked multinational corporations. Weissman helped make HIV drugs available to the developing world and has provided assistance to lots of governments that have questions about intellectual property and access to medicine. He previously worked as a public interest attorney at the Center for Study of Responsive Law. He's a member of the Ohio Bar, and he earned his JD from Harvard Law School, where he graduated magna cum laude. Welcome, Robert.
It's great to be with you. Thank you. So apologies for that bio there. It's a little long.
Well deserved.
We could have given you the shorter version. Weissman's a friend of CODEPINK. That would have been it. So Marcy said I'm prohibited from giving you a PowerPoint because she said it's boring. She didn't know that my PowerPoints are really interesting. So I'm going to try to be interesting without a PowerPoint. And without the professor, I guess I back up to a couple, I'm going to allocate a couple extra minutes to myself. And what I want to do is talk about the problem of the vaccine apartheid we're facing. And I want to focus on something that's a little bit different than the solutions you're going to follow up with, which is a proposal that we're developing and pushing forward for the US government to take the lead in ensuring that companies transfer their technology to both the poor countries and to use by the US government so that we can scale up vaccine production and end the pandemic at least a year faster than it otherwise is going to go. And what I wanted to do, and along the way, the two things that you're working on about the waiver that the World Trade Organization on intellectual property laws completely lines up with that, as well as HR 986, which is a really important proposal about how the US should function at the International Monetary Fund to make sure countries have the ability to economically deal with the problems caused by the pandemic. So what I'm going to do is talk about 4 different things. This would have been slides, Marcy, just so you know. 4 things. First is a little bit of an overview of the problem, some of which you may be familiar with, but just to contextualize it. Second, to talk about how the vaccines were developed, and I'll give you a preview. The answer is overwhelmingly with US government support. Then I want to talk about this idea that we have for this $25 billion expenditure to make sure everybody in the world has a vaccine and end the pandemic. And then last, to talk about what the benefits are, both in terms of the pandemic and also sort of the broader political economy. So first, in terms of the scale of the problem, as it happens, this is an unusual disease, COVID-19. It's hit worst, at least as best we know, in the richer countries. But it's in part aided by Trump, who made it worse here. But it is severe in developing countries too, and for sure, really underreported. So we have trouble knowing the exact scale of the problem. There have been probably about 50 million cases in the developing world and about 1 million deaths in the developing world so far, according to what's officially reported. The bulk of those in Latin America. Mexico and Brazil are 2 of the worst countries after the US in terms of both incidence rate and death totals. But beyond the health problems, and as you can imagine, poor countries just don't have the health infrastructure to treat people with the disease. Beyond that has been the economic ramifications, which are really severe. So as tough as the quarantines and shutdowns have been here and in rich countries, it is much more devastating in poor countries. But the World Bank estimates that 170 million people have been thrown into serious poverty as a result of the pandemic, less than $5.50 a day. And about 70 million are below $2 a day. More, this is 70 million more or 170 million more than was the case prior to the pandemic. So the economic consequences are really far reaching. And I don't have time to talk about it, but you can take a second to think about that, and you guys think about these things. What does it mean to live under $2 a day? What's going on? And recognize the pandemic is inflicting that on tens of millions of people in poor countries around the world. So that's a little bit of setting up what the problem is. In terms of access to the vaccine, well, it's been pretty terrible. So the rich countries make up about 19% of adults, and they've put purchase orders in for something like 55 or 60% of the overall vaccine, but that really understates the severity of things. As of like mid-February, 10 countries had been responsible for about 3/4 of the vaccines administered. And throughout Africa and many poor countries in other areas, there's really very little access to the vaccine right now. And it's not coming anytime in the immediate future. In terms of the trajectory we're on for really getting people vaccinated globally, there's a lot of competing estimates of that, but I think optimistically would be by the end of 2023, but we really could be going into 2024 or even longer. And some views are actually, we'll never vaccinate everybody, just too difficult and too expensive. Okay, so that's kind of what the status quo is. And there's some important things that are trying to be charitable, and I'll talk about those, but that's taking into account the major charitable initiative from the Gates Foundation. Okay, so that would be bad enough just as a matter of justice and humanitarianism. But it is not the case that these vaccines, which are being rationed this way, are in any sense the property of the private vaccine makers. They really were, all of them depend heavily and sometimes totally on governmental investment. Private companies didn't pay any attention to the coronavirus prior to the pandemic. Like this is a category, coronaviruses, which has caused other diseases, and the public sector was investing. The NIH invested about $700 million in the 15 years prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. Effectively, there was nothing from the drug companies. There were 6 clinical trials that they had done. They were all publicly funded. And then as the vaccines we have, if you talk about the Moderna one is really misnamed. It really should be the NIH vaccine. It relies on a product that's patented by the NIH. 100% or virtually 100% of the development costs for that vaccine were paid for by the US government. The US government also gave an almost $2 billion advance purchase commitment to Moderna. And it's more or less the same thing for Pfizer, not quite as extreme. Pfizer's product is actually licensed from a German company. The German company had $400 million in early investment from the German government. All of the companies are relying on platform technologies that were developed by the National Institutes of Health. So there's a campaign for a people's vaccine. It sort of is, these are people vaccines. They've just been privatized and appropriated by the big pharma companies. So when you take that into account, you recognize there's extra leverage and extra cause for thinking about how we solve the problem differently. So I think the primary narrative that's been put forward to deal with this, and there's been more and more attention to the problem, is, well, we should be a little more generous in how we share the vaccine. So we've got a limited supply, and it's really not fair to have it all allocated to rich countries. And that's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't take us very far, because the real problem is we don't have enough supply. So instead of just worrying about how we ration a limited product, a limited quantity, it makes more sense to think about how we can expand supply. And there aren't natural limitations on how much of the different vaccines we can make. The limitations are the number of manufacturers and the control they exercise over the technology. If they were to license their technology to other manufacturers and show them how to make it, they could ramp up production extremely quickly. There are some raw materials and stuff that are sort of sciencey complicated things, but not that complicated. And that could all be managed if there's will. So the reason we don't have a bigger supply and we're not on track to have a bigger supply is entirely political. It's not a technology problem at all. So what we're recommending is that the US, which has, as I said, really driven most of the research, this is leaving aside sort of the Russian and Chinese vaccines, but has driven most of the underlying research, that the US government take a leadership position and say, okay, we're going to facilitate the transfer of that technology from Moderna and Pfizer and their monopoly control, but not just their control over the patents, their control of the know-how, to other manufacturers. And we think that the government should set up a network of manufacturing facilities in the United States and in poor countries. If the US government proceeded to do that, we've done a pretty deep dive into how doable that is and what the cost would be. And we think all in cost, conservatively, I mean, we think we're estimating high, would be $25 billion. And that within a year, we could have produced 8 billion doses of the vaccine, which would be enough to take care of all low and middle income countries. So that's $3 a dose. It's a great deal. And it will require some significant public investment, but it's not that big a number when we're throwing trillions of dollars around in the reconciliation bills and in the infrastructure bills. It requires some investment, and it would require the government's telling the vaccine makers, you don't get to hold this technology close. You're going to have to share it. Either you do it in a voluntary way, and we'll pay you a little bit for sharing it out, or if you don't do it in a voluntary way, we're going to compel you to do it either using existing law, which is, I think, strong enough, or with a new law that would specifically authorize the government to do this. So we would break their monopoly control, and if we break their monopoly control, then everything becomes possible, and including really speeding up manufacturing for what's really a low price. So we think if we were to do that, we would end up ending the pandemic at least a year earlier than what we're otherwise looking at. So let's just talk about what that means and some of the other consequences. So the first major thing it would mean is obviously lives saved. And it's hard to say exactly how many, because as I said, we don't know that. Of course, we don't know how the pandemic is going to spin out, but also we don't have good data on what's happening in the poor countries. But we have, it would be reasonable to expect we would save hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe more, by shaving a year or more off the pandemic. So that's a pretty big deal. We would also address this poverty problem because these kind of shutdowns are going to continue in the low and middle income countries so long as the pandemic is rampaging there. So all those people who've been thrown into poverty, there'll be an opportunity for them to escape those really dire circumstances. So the humanitarian benefits are really tremendous. There are also really direct benefits to the U.S. government, or to the United States, probably the U.S. government too, but to the United States people. And the biggest and most important one is the public health benefit. So long as the pandemic is spinning out of control, we're going to have more and more of these variants. And it's a good guess that many of those variants are not going to be susceptible to the existing vaccine. We've already seen that. But the longer the pandemic spins out of control, more variants, more likely to come here, and the more likely we have a problem back in the US. So the public health benefit domestically is easily enough to merit doing this. There'd be huge domestic economic benefits too. Our friends at the International Chamber of Commerce estimate that the pandemic is costing trillions of dollars to the rich countries. It will continue to cost the rich countries trillions of dollars so long as the poor countries are more or less shut down from the pandemic. And I think it's estimated to be a few $100 billion perhaps annually just in the United States. So those are all big benefits. And if you think about sort of the broader question of US foreign policy, you're imagining a US government that's functioning in a way really with no precedent, actually sharing the technology, building up some technological capacity in poor countries, not operating on behalf of multinational corporations, but fulfilling a genuine humanitarian purpose. It would be an almost unimaginable transformation, but it is imaginable. And I think it's actually achievable. There's a last direct benefit to the US before I talk about the broader thing and wind this down, which is it is likely, reasonably likely, that the existing variants, leaving aside new ones, are going to require us to get booster shots to deal with new versions, new variants, new strains of coronavirus in coming years. So Pfizer says they think it's going to be annual. We'll need an annual booster shot like people get a flu shot. They also say, hey, they've been really generous in light of the public health emergency, and they're pricing extremely reasonably. Prices are like $30 a shot. They have no intention of continuing that going forward. Instead, they want to price like they regularly price for vaccines, which according to them means between $150 and $300 a shot. So if you just think about the US, forget the rest of the world. Let's just imagine 100 million people need to get the shot or going to get the shot every year, and multiply that by $300 and think about this constant stream of money coming out of people's pockets and into the drug company's treasury based on their exploitation of public investment. And you got to say, what the hell would we do that for? Why? Because instead, if we had a network of manufacturing capacity in the US, the government could make these booster shots and could make them for the $3 charge is probably a high estimate for these upcoming booster shots. So just dramatic savings for consumers and for the government, which would end up paying such a substantial portion of this. So, and if you think about that, and here's the sort of the last point, it helps you begin to, for those of us who work on sort of issues generally about the prices and access for drugs and vaccines and so on, it's a different model of how to do business. It recognizes the core public investment and research and development for drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, and devices, and says, okay, when the government spends all this stuff and we get product, we can't just give it away and then let the drug companies make all the money off of it, charging us who paid for it in the first place. Instead, we can start thinking either we're going to impose some reasonable pricing conditions on them, or we're going to treat these things as public goods. We're going to get away from this monopoly model, which we don't need, and permit competition. Or sometimes we might choose, as we the people through the government, to just make this stuff ourselves. So it really begins to think about a whole new kind of economy around biomedical research and development, which is its own pretty big area. And those of you working along with us on Medicare for All know that like the drug part of the story for Medicare for All, big deal. So the implications of this as it gets to that are really consequential.
Thank you, Robert.
So I want to wind it down there and just appreciate your guys' time and happy to chat as long as you want to go.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Robert. That was illuminating, and we're going to be taking action on your call for the vaccine as a public good tonight. We now are thrilled to go to an immunologist, Professor Rath Satyajit. I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's calling in from India. This is a very special treat for us. He is with the Indian Institute of Science, Education, and Research, and he's here to talk about the global vaccination drive, the way forward to flatten the COVID-19 curve. India was one of the initiators of the political declaration on equitable global access to COVID-19 vaccines that garnered a lot of support, from more than 180 UN member states. And basically the declaration calls for a global ceasefire for vaccine distribution and recognition that the vaccine should be, as Robert Weissman just said, a public good available to everyone. Welcome, Satyajit.
Thank you. It's early enough in the morning that I'm likely to be a little dazed, but for what it is worth. Let me add to what Robert Weissman has been saying as I joined, and let me make quick comments first, and then perhaps I can deal with questions in a minute. So before I get to India, let me make a couple of more general points. Making COVID-19 vaccines has been possible, enabled, whatever we call it, because in the first place, publicly funded research the world over has been working on the relatively simple situations of protection in such acute virus-caused illnesses for a very long time, so that we understand enough, just enough, to design vaccines with a reasonable expectation of their working just well enough. Publicly funded research has in fact been working on developing actual vaccines for diseases similar to COVID-19, SARS, MERS, over the past 2 decades, and has in fact had such vaccine candidates to a certain extent road tested quite a bit, so to say. And most of the current COVID-19 vaccines in emergency use the world over are based on this background work. In fact, many of them have come directly from publicly funded research to the for-profit pharma sector, as was just pointed out. This last point is not only correct for vaccines from, say, China, Russia, more about which in a minute, which have gone from publicly funded research institutions to state-controlled pharma sectors, but also of the USA, where the Moderna vaccine comes from the NIH, for the UK, where the AstraZeneca vaccine comes from Oxford University, and from here in India, where our current homemade vaccine under emergency use approval comes, which is from Bharat Biotech, which is a private for-profit company, but comes from the Indian Council of Medical Research with public funding. So these are facts I think it's important to keep in mind when pharma lobbyists talk about stifling innovation in the private sector of vaccine development. That said, it also allows me to do a segue to India. With respect to COVID-19 vaccines, India is in somewhat of an odd position. While India is clearly part of the global south, while we have our own difficulties with tracking the pandemic, responding to the pandemic, expanding our vaccination campaign, and I'm happy to talk about that, the fact still remains that it is a major powerhouse in the world where generic non-patented vaccines are concerned. In fact, it has been the world's largest manufacturer and exporter of such old-fashioned, widely used generic non-patented vaccines. So you'd expect that under such a situation, Indian vaccine manufacturers would easily develop COVID-19 vaccines. You'd be only partially correct. They do have the capacity to manufacture, but they have not had the intellectual property access to do this for new vaccines, such as the COVID-19 ones. As a result, some of them have indeed begun to develop their own. Zydus Cadila in India is one example. They're currently testing their candidate in advanced clinical trials. Another company, Bharat Biotech, has sourced its vaccine, as I noted, from the public sector, from the Indian Council of Medical Research. Despite somewhat premature approvals in pursuit of nationalist chest thumping, this is indeed a reasonable vaccine. However, it's hard to scale up its manufacture because it involves growing the infectious virus itself, inactivating it, and using that as the core of the vaccine formulation. And safety considerations mean that scale-up manufacture becomes that much harder. But all other vaccine manufacturers in India, including the major supplier in global news at the moment, the oddly named Serum Institute of India, which is really just a private vaccine manufacturing company, have licensed vaccine candidates from overseas and are serving as expansion manufacturing hubs within the limits and the remit of those licenses. So what do we need for much greater levels of such expansion? And it's not simply access to patented information. It also includes associated information such as trade secrets and protected data on clinical trials. This is the background of the India-South Africa proposal to the WTO to waive all IP protection for COVID-19 vaccines globally so that supplies can be rapidly ramped up. The global north, of course, has initially nixed this, although there seem to be some glimmerings of change on that issue. And it would be extremely useful to press for the USA to confirm this change and to put its weight behind such a proposal at the WTO. A second disturbing and interesting trend that fits into another larger pattern is that the Russian and the Chinese vaccines, despite apparently being reasonably effective in the clinical trials that have taken place across the world, are not finding regulatory fast tracking, not only in the global north, but also in arenas of northern influence, including in India, where their regulatory approvals are still happening. Although many other countries have in fact both given them regulatory emergency approval and have begun in fact to use and deploy them. As a matter of fact, the Russian and Chinese vaccines seem to be the major vaccines that are being exported to the global south at the moment, in addition to some output from the WHO COVAX initiative, quite a bit of it which comes from India. The only international collaborative effort that reduces international power games to supply COVID-19 vaccines to the world is WHO's COVAX initiative. That also has not enthusiastically approved Russian and Chinese vaccines for its usages yet, and it would be very useful to press the USA, which has taken the first laudable step of rejoining the WHO, to support a diverse portfolio of vaccines sourced from anywhere in the world, so long as the data are available for COVAX approval and usage. These, I think, are important nuanced steps to push for, since the simpler approach to press for expanded manufacture and supply of, say, the NIH Moderna vaccine or the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine internationally through COVAX is limited by the current ultra cold chain requirement of these mRNA-based vaccines. Now, it's probable that data will soon emerge that the ultra cold chain, the ultra cold chain, the minus 70, minus 80 degrees Celsius cold chain is not perhaps as critically required as it seems to be at the moment. But those data are still awaited. And at that cold chain requirement at the moment, distribution of these vaccines, even in India, is for the public sector really going to work only in urban metropolitan distribution centers. In rural India, this is simply not going to be possible, and I suspect that that is the case across a fair swath of the global south. So this is why I'm saying that there are multiple nuanced steps to push for. Clearly, there is a tendency to push, to play games with COVID-19 vaccines. This includes commercial backbiting games, such as between manufacturers. AstraZeneca's worries about blood clots being expanded, all sorts of other issues with other manufacturers that rival manufacturers will keep bringing up. But it's also true that COVID-19 vaccines have become part of an international realpolitik power game structure, where rather than providing vaccines through the COVAX initiative, countries, Russia, China, India, have begun providing vaccines as their own gifts in international power game influences. And if we are going to reduce the inimical impact of these, what I would argue are callous games, is to press for an enabled, diverse portfolio of approvals in and supplies to the WHO COVAX program for equitable distribution to the world's needs. Two arguments I have heard repeatedly in a variety of international fora, and that have some bearing on this issue. One is that for once, it is the global north that is bearing the brunt of COVID-19, so the vaccines should go there first anyway. The second is that countries have an obligation to their own citizens first where vaccine supply is concerned. So in the first place, it's not clear that the spread of the disease in poor countries is as reliably tracked as it is in the global north. Many scholars think that this underestimating of disease is even true to some extent. To what extent, it's not clear in India. But in the first place, a 5-fold excess of vaccine bookings, such as apparently seems to have been done by the Canadian government, for example, or a 2-3-fold booking, fold meaning a booking of priority vaccine dose supplies 2, 3, or 5 times as many as there are citizens in the country, one would argue seems a little excessive to organize for yourself before you begin to think of the rest of the world. And the reality is that in the globally connected world, so long as the disease simmers and smolders in one place in the world without vaccination coverage, the rest of the world remains at increased risk of emerging variants of the virus that will be resistant to both natural infection and to these first generation vaccines. In reality, it is absolutely essential to press for greater vaccine manufacturing access via the WTO, for greater regulatory approval diversity to vaccines that are shown to be effective no matter where in the world they're from, and for vaccine supply via the WHO's COVAX initiative rather than through the realpolitik of international power games, as critical for ensuring that the rest of the world gets COVID-19 vaccines in good enough time so as to protect not simply the global south, but also the global north.
Right. Professor Rath,
really, that's where I would like to stop.
Yes, thank you so much. And you have such a voluminous knowledge about this, and we wish we could have a much longer conversation, but we do have some questions in the chat, and at some point maybe you and Robert have questions of each other. Jim in Milwaukee said, so are Russia and China providing vaccines to the global south at below cost prices? Is that what I heard? So maybe Robert or Satyajit, you would like to, one of you would like to take that one. And then if you have questions of each other, by all means. So Russia and China, what's happening with Russia and China and the vaccine?
Well, as I said, there's a two-pronged strategy. There's the straightforward commercial strategy that, for example, the Gamaleya Institute Sputnik 5 is being sold at, or Sinopharm's vaccines are being sold at. And those are, I don't think, being sold at below cost prices. But there's also gift from governments. And certainly the Chinese government has done this. The Russian government has done this to a certain extent. The Indian government has done this within the South Asian region as well as outside. Gifted vaccine numbers are not large. They are much more in the hundreds of thousands category to a large extent, although there have been, particularly from the Chinese government, very much larger numbers gifted. But those are outright gifts. They're not below cost sales. And clearly, for all three countries included, if you are, in my eyes, if you're gifting vaccines outside the COVAX program, then you're doing it as a matter of what I'm calling international power games. But Robert Weissman?
Robert, is there anything you want to add about the vaccines that are being produced by the countries?
No, I think that's all right, except price isn't so much the issue right now. That's the only thing I would say. So it's exactly right. I mean, the bulk of what's going to go to poor countries, maybe all of it, will be donated at the end of the day. I think there are some price issues, as I said, going forward, especially in the rich countries after we're through the pandemic. But for right now, prices, it's quantity of supply. The monopoly problem is not about price. The monopoly problem is about limited supply.
So I have a question. What's the probability of Biden moving to waive patent protections on big pharma, for the World Trade Organization to do the same, if that's what they have the authority to do? What do you both think about that? What are the possibilities for a people's vaccine, a public good vaccine?
Well, those are layers of questions. They're not all the same question. In terms of what the U.S. government is likely to do with the TRIPS waiver, so just to step back and say what that is, that's the proposal that was being referenced, introduced initially by India and South Africa, that countries should have freedom from the otherwise existing intellectual property obligations of the World Trade Organization. It's in an agreement known as TRIPS, as it relates to COVID prevention, treatment, and diagnostic technologies. So it's a limited waiver of the global intellectual property rules, patent and copyright especially, as it relates to COVID. And I think the answer is it's more likely than not that the Biden administration is going to go along with that. That builds both on a lot of historic work, including the work on HIV/AIDS, how the administration is approaching the pandemic domestically, and that there's a lot of work on trade over the years. So that's not a victory that's yet in hand, but I think we're more likely than not to win. I also think, it's as important as it is, it doesn't do everything. So it doesn't deal with this other kind, it doesn't do with the affirmative transfer of know-how from the manufacturers, and that's going to take a different kind of engagement, at least as regards the US technologies, from the US government. And we're not quite there on that. But I'm hopeful we can get there.
Okay, let's see, other questions? Do you have any questions of each other? Any comments? No? All right, so what are we looking at in terms of delivery of a people's vaccine? What's the time frame here? And perhaps this might be a time where Alan Minsky, you're there? You might want to weigh in with the letter from Schakowsky's office.
I shall do that. And it's really just a very simple two-step process here. I'll make it three, actually. Here is a one-pager from Public Citizen, which talks about we must end trade pact obstructions against global productions of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. And that is just dropped into the chat right now. And then the broader electronic toolkit for people who are interested in helping out. And I'm going to explain why this is maybe a little bit more detailed than what we often have with our, and Rob could chime in on this too. But I've been participating in calls with a guy named Ryan Harvey, who was actually an old friend of mine, now works for Lori Wallach at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and with Lori herself and a group of organizations that are working on this. And right now they have 75 signatories or thereabouts. They're looking to get up to the majority of the current House membership, which would be about 207. Is that right? No, it'd be a little bit higher than that. No, 107 rather. Be a little higher. So it'd be about 110 let's just say 111 would get you to 222, and that's the full delegation once the 3 seats that are empty are filled. So they're at 75. They want to get to 111 signatures, and some of the offices that they're reaching out to still haven't really been effectively reached out to. There's some so-called low-hanging fruit there to still get, but there's some complicated resistance to it too. Pharmaceuticals are a little bit more popular on Capitol Hill than they were even just 18 months ago, because just the effectiveness of their messaging around presenting themselves as being heroic players in the generation of the vaccines. But also, maybe it's just different and harder to get the Democrats to sign on to a letter that goes against the wishes of the pharmaceutical industry when it could actually have teeth, because obviously the Democrats are in power. They were able to get support for this kind of gesture from more offices when Trump was in power and McConnell was a bloc in the Senate. So right now, it's important to make the calls tonight that we're going to make, but also to sign up to be a liaison for CODEPINK. And if you can sign up tonight, and I'm looking for that link, which is right here. And then also look at the 2 other links that I dropped into the chat and review what is in the second link, which is a lot of great information. It's very precise, it's very concise. And then follow up in the coming days by making calls to offices during business hours. And if you sign up for the CODEPINK liaisons tonight, I'll coordinate with Marcy, and I will help reach out to you along with the PDA team to get this information to you and the list of offices, the target list of offices. So if you are a constituent in a district for a congressperson who hasn't signed on yet, especially if you're in about the 30 to 35 districts that right now Global Trade Watch, Public Citizen Global Trade Watch is focusing on, they believe can very soon, because the time frame is tight, get this signed on. Then they'll close the number of signatures once they hit that majority mark, send it on to the White House, asking the Biden administration to support and advocate for this WTO TRIPS waiver. So again, there are the 2 links up there that explain what the project is. The second one is more detailed. The one that's above is a little bit more concise and precise. Sign up again to be a CODEPINK liaison, and hopefully a few of you will sign up and we can get you calling into your congressional office. We can get more signatories and we can get this letter out to Joe Biden as soon as possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Alan Minsky, Executive Director of Progressive Democrats of America. I want to thank all of our guests. I want to ask people to unmute and to thank Robert Weissman, a public citizen, and Professor Rath Satyajit who phoned in from India, got up early to share his immense knowledge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you getting up so early, and Rob, great work of public citizen.
Absolutely.
Yay.
Yay, and I think this really could be a game changer, in terms of recognizing that the public funds this sort of innovation. We should own it. Absolutely. Okay, we're going to move to the portion of our Zoom in which we engage in a Capitol calling party. And tonight we're going to be urging our representatives, our House representatives, to co-sponsor legislation. Mary is going to post both in the chat the complete script, and she's also going to give us a link on the screen where you can directly find the script. But before she does that, and before Hanieh, if Hanieh is available, takes us through what we're going to do step by step, I did want to urge you, and I know that many of you probably already have this in your phone, but to find out who is the foreign policy staffer for your congressperson. Try to develop a relationship with that person and meet with them. If you are not affiliated with an organization in your congressional district, we can organize one together, CODEPINK, Progressive Democrats of America, because as a friend of mine said, if you're not with an organization, you're not organizing, right? And we want to reach out to everyone in Congress and move this agenda. So, Hanieh, maybe while Mary is posting in the chat, you can explain what we're going to do.
Absolutely. So this is the fun part of, we love our speakers, they're wonderful, they're fantastic, but this is where we get some work done, right? So when Mary shares her screen, we're going to have the number to the switchboard where you will call and enter your zip code. Usually there is someone live where you can contact and speak to, give them your zip code, and they will connect you with your congressional representative. But if not, what it's going to ask you to do to enter your zip code, and it'll automatically direct you to their office. Now, most of the time, because it is late, there may not be there. So what you're going to do is you're going to read the script word by word. If you want to add your spice to it, you're more than welcome to. Once Mary shares it, I can go over it with you one more time. And as far as
Chat now, just want to let you know.
oh, great. Mary, will you be sharing your screen also?
I think the screen will just have a link, but in the chat is the.
Well, I can share the screen for a moment if it would help.
Sure. That'd be great.
So people have two options. If you want, she's going to share the screen, and you can click on the link and go to the script on the CODEPINK Congress website. Or if you want to look at the chat, the script is also in the chat.
Yeah, and the phone number, the 202 number is listed also. If you can maybe scroll up a little bit, Mary, for everyone to be able to see the number. Also, as far as your contacting the White House, and again, we'd urge you to really hold on to this information and just write that number for the switchboard. Save it on your phone, so every week when you come on the call, you could just find it from your contact and get to dialing. But in terms of contacting the White House, what you're going to do is you're going to use this link that I will be posting in the chat and fill out the form, cut and paste the content that has been so well put together by Marcy in that form, and click send it away.
Again, in your own voice if you want. This is just a guide, but it's helpful to have. So thank you so much, Hanieh, for taking us through that.
Yeah, and Marcy, can I just add that we are going to have some lounge music playing while you call out your congressional members?
Before we start the lounge music, I just wanted to scroll back up through the chat. Now I can't find it, I'm sorry. Mary, I know that you posted it here, the script.
Here, I can post it.
Oh, here we go. Okay, so I'm calling my congressperson. I called the switchboard. They asked me who I want to speak to. And then I reached Congressman Carbajal, who represents Santa Barbara, which is where I am in California. I said, my name is Marcy. I'm from this zip code. Please urge President Biden to support a waiver of patent protections for patent protections on vaccines so manufacturers around the world can copy the formulas and massively increase production. Also, please ask Biden to sign an executive order to enable sanctioned countries to access COVID vaccines and medical supplies. And I believe there was another request. Okay, there's another request of Biden. Do we put that one in the chat too? So, yeah.
There's a script to Biden, and then there's one for senators.
So the one for Biden is going to be an email, and it will also include, I believe it also includes reference to the Schakowsky letter, does it?
Mm-hmm. I believe so.
It does.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, great. All right, so let's go.
Exciting.
All right, I'm calling.
Do unmute yourselves if you have any questions. We will be right here doing this together. So happy calling, everyone.
Yeah.